The rain hammered against the tall windows of the Manhattan office building, where I worked my second shift as a janitor, each drop echoing the exhaustion that had settled deep into my bones. At 23, my life had become a carefully choreographed dance of survival. Morning shifts as a secretary at a law firm downtown, evening classes at community college twice a week, and nights cleaning corporate offices until my hands cracked from chemical cleaners and my feet screamed for mercy. I told myself it was temporary, that once I finished my business degree, everything would change. That the cramped studio apartment in Queens, with its perpetual smell of mildew, and the neighbor who played bass at 3 a.m, would become a distant memory. But 6 months ago, everything had already changed in ways I could never have anticipated, in ways that terrified me so completely that I had spent every single day since then running from a truth I could no longer hide. It started with a phone call from my supervisor at the catering company, where I occasionally picked up extra work on weekends. They needed someone last minute for a private event at the Celestial, the kind of hotel where doormen wore white gloves and a single night in the presidential suite cost more than I made in 3 months. I almost said no. I was exhausted, my feet still aching from a double shift the day before. But the pay was triple my usual rate, and my landlord had just raised the rent again. So I put on the required black dress and white apron, pulled my dark blonde hair into a tight bun, and showed up at the service entrance with 20 other servers who looked just as tired and desperate as I felt. The ballroom was breathtaking in a way that felt almost obscene. Crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than my student loans, marble floors so polished I could see my reflection, and guests dripping in designer labels and jewelry that could fund a small country. I moved through the crowd with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, invisible in the way service workers always are to the wealthy, until I felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned, and that's when I saw him for the first time. He stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, impossibly tall and commanding in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my car. His dark hair was styled in that effortlessly perfect, slicked-back way that European men seem to master. And even from across the room I could see the sharp angles of his jaw, the intensity of his gaze, the way everyone around him seemed to lean slightly away, as if acknowledging an invisible radius of power. Adrian Caruso. I didn't know his name then, but I would learn it soon enough, along with everything else that made him both fascinating and absolutely terrifying. He didn't look away when I caught him staring, didn't pretend polite disinterest the way most people do. Instead, he raised his glass slightly in acknowledgement, the corner of his mouth lifting in something that wasn't quite a smile, but held more meaning than any words could convey. My heart started racing in a way that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of carrying heavy trays, and I told myself to look away, to remember that I was there to work, not to get tangled up with men who wore Rolex watches and radiated danger like cologne. But he found me anyway during my break, in the empty service corridor where I was trying to catch my breath and give my aching feet a rest. He appeared so quietly I didn't notice him until he spoke, his voice low and accented in ways that suggested Italian roots and expensive boarding schools. We talked for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, about art, about the hypocrisy of wealth, about my dreams of finishing school and starting my own business someday. He listened in a way that made me feel like I was the only person in the entire city. And when he touched my hand, just a brief brush of his fingers against mine, I felt electricity shoot through my entire body. I should have walked away then. I should have recognized the warning signs, the way other guests gave him a wide berth, the deference in their eyes that went beyond respect into something closer to fear, the fact that he had 3 men in dark suits watching from a distance who were clearly not there for conversation. But I was 23 and exhausted, and so tired of being invisible, and when he asked if I wanted to see the view from the rooftop garden after my shift ended, I heard myself say yes, before my rational brain could intervene. The rooftop was empty, the city spread out below us like a carpet of stars, and when he kissed me against the glass railing with the wind whipping around us, I forgot every sensible thought I'd ever had. We went to his suite. Of course he had a suite, probably had several. And what happened next was the kind of night that exists only in movies or romance novels that embarrass you to read on the subway. He was intense and gentle and completely present in ways I had never experienced. And for those few hours, I let myself believe that maybe fairy tales could happen to girls like me. That maybe I could be someone worth pursuing by a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine. But morning came the way it always does, and with it came reality. While he slept, I checked my phone and made the mistake of Googling his name. What I found made my blood turn to ice. Articles about organized crime, investigations into money laundering and racketeering, photographs of him leaving courthouses with lawyers who specialized in getting dangerous men acquitted. Adrian Caruso wasn't just wealthy and powerful. He was the head of one of the most feared crime families on the East Coast. A man whose business interests included everything from legitimate real estate to decidedly less legal enterprises that I didn't want to think about too carefully. I dressed in complete silence, my hands shaking so badly I could barely button my shirt, and I left without waking him. I threw away the business card he'd left on the nightstand with his private number, deleted the hotel from my map history, and spent the entire subway ride home, trying to convince myself that it had been a one-time mistake, a momentary lapse in judgment that I would never repeat. I told myself that men like Adrian Caruso didn't pursue girls like me beyond a single night, that he probably had a dozen women more sophisticated and beautiful than I could ever hope to be, that I would never see him again, and that was for the best. 2 weeks later, I took a pregnancy test in the bathroom of a CVS, and when both lines appeared, I sat on that toilet for 20 minutes, trying to remember how to breathe. The second test confirmed it. So did the third. I made an appointment with a clinic in Brooklyn under a fake name, paid in cash, and listened to the doctor confirm what I already knew. I was approximately 6 weeks pregnant, healthy, and facing a decision that would define the rest of my life. I thought about terminating the pregnancy. I'm not ashamed to admit that. I thought about it seriously, made appointments I didn't keep, researched options until my eyes burned. But every time I got close to making that choice, something stopped me. Not religion or morality or any external pressure, but something deeper and more fundamental that I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the fact that I'd grown up without a father and knew exactly what that absence felt like. Maybe it was the stubborn hope that I could do this, that I could be the kind of mother I'd always wished I'd had. Or maybe it was just sheer terrifying optimism that somehow, impossibly, everything would work out. What I knew with absolute certainty was that I could not tell Adrian. The man was a mobster, someone who solved problems with violence and intimidation, someone whose world operated by rules I couldn't begin to understand. What would he do if he knew? Would he think I'd gotten pregnant on purpose to trap him? Would he see the baby as a liability, something that could be used against him by rivals or prosecutors? Would he try to take the child away from me, or worse, make both of us disappear? I had no framework for understanding how a man like that would react, and I wasn't brave enough to find out. So I decided to hide it. I moved to a different apartment in Washington Heights, using a sublet I found through a friend of a friend, paying 3 months up front in cash. I changed my phone number, deleted all my social media accounts, and told everyone who asked that I was dealing with family issues back home that required privacy. At work, I started wearing progressively looser clothing, invested in compression garments that cost more than I could afford, and developed elaborate lies about a back injury that explained why I moved carefully and couldn't lift heavy objects. When morning sickness hit hard during my second month, I blamed it on food poisoning and chronic migraines. When my body started changing in ways I couldn't quite hide, I stopped going to company events, turned down lunch invitations, and cultivated a reputation for being antisocial and intensely private. The lies compounded on themselves, growing more elaborate and exhausting with each passing week. By the time I reached my 5th month, the deception had become a full-time job that required more energy than my actual employment. Every morning started with the same careful routine, standing sideways in front of my bathroom mirror, assessing how much my body had changed overnight, strategizing which combination of loose sweaters and high-waisted pants would best disguise the curve that was becoming increasingly difficult to hide. I had invested in an entire wardrobe of oversized blazers from thrift stores, flowing tunics that I layered strategically, and scarves that I draped in ways that drew the eye away from my midsection. My coworkers probably thought I had developed some bizarre fashion obsession or was hiding dramatic weight gain, but they were too polite or too disinterested to ask directly. The physical challenges were relentless and unforgiving. My secretary job required me to sit at a desk for 8 hours, and I had developed an elaborate system of positioning my chair at angles that prevented anyone from seeing my profile, of timing my bathroom breaks for moments when the office was empty, of eating lunch alone at my desk while everyone else gathered in the break room. The evening cleaning shift was even worse, bending, lifting, reaching, all while trying to protect a growing belly that seemed determined to announce itself to the world. I had to quit the catering work entirely after nearly passing out during a wedding reception, making up a story about a family emergency that required me to take a leave of absence. Money became a crushing source of anxiety that kept me awake most nights. Prenatal care, even at the sliding scale clinic I'd found in the Bronx, was expensive. Prenatal vitamins, new clothes every few weeks as nothing fit anymore, the security deposit for the new apartment, the burner phone I'd bought in case of emergencies. It all added up faster than I could earn it. I picked up freelance transcription work online, typing late into the night until my fingers cramped and my eyes burned, listening to legal depositions and medical dictations, while trying not to think about my own situation. I sold everything of value I owned: my laptop, my jewelry, even the textbooks from college that I'd planned to keep for reference. I stopped going to classes entirely, telling myself I would return after the baby came, knowing deep down that was probably a lie I told myself to make the present more bearable. The isolation was perhaps the hardest part, even harder than the physical discomfort or the financial stress. I had never been someone with a large social circle, but I'd had friends, casual relationships with coworkers, a network of people who made life feel less lonely. All of that disappeared the moment I decided to hide the pregnancy. I stopped responding to text messages, declined every invitation, invented excuses for why I couldn't meet for coffee or drinks or even a quick lunch. My best friend from college, Sarah, who had known me since freshman year, called me 17 times in 1 week before finally sending a message that said she was worried about me, and would I please just confirm I was alive. I responded with a brief text claiming I was dealing with a family crisis and needed space, then blocked her number because I knew if I heard her voice I would break down and tell her everything. The appointments with my obstetrician became the only human contact I allowed myself beyond surface-level work interactions. Dr. Patricia Chen was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, who ran a practice specializing in patients who needed discretion or couldn't afford traditional care. She asked questions at my first visit, about the father, about my support system, about my plans for after the birth, and when I gave evasive answers or obvious lies, she simply made notes in my chart and moved on to discussing prenatal nutrition and the importance of staying hydrated. Every month I would show up for my appointment, listen to the heartbeat that still made me cry no matter how many times I heard it, look at the ultrasound images that I kept hidden in a locked box under my bed, and receive the same advice about rest and proper nutrition that I couldn't always follow. The baby became real to me gradually, then all at once. For the first few months, it had been an abstract concept, something happening to my body that I was managing like a complicated medical condition. But then, I felt the first flutter of movement during my 4th month, so faint I thought I'd imagined it, followed a week later by an unmistakable kick that made me gasp out loud during a meeting at work. After that, the baby was a constant presence, a little person who seemed to have opinions about what I ate and when I slept, and definitely about my posture. I started talking to them, never out loud where someone might hear, but internally, in my head, during the long, lonely nights when insomnia kept me awake. I told them about my day, about the things I wished I could give them, about the father they would never know, and whether that made me selfish or protective or just desperately afraid. I thought about Adrian constantly, even though I tried not to. I would see men on the subway with similar builds, and my heart would race before I realized it wasn't him. I dreamed about him regularly. Sometimes the good memories of that night, the gentleness in his touch and the way he'd looked at me like I mattered, but more often nightmares where he discovered the truth and his expression turned cold and dangerous. I Googled him obsessively in those early months, reading every article I could find about his business dealings, his legal troubles, his family history. There were photographs of him at charity galas with beautiful women in designer dresses, leaving restaurants with associates who all looked like they could kill someone without breaking a sweat, emerging from courthouses with that same intense expression I remembered from our first meeting. One article described him as ruthless but fair, someone who commanded loyalty through a combination of fear and genuine care for those under his protection. Another detailed a violent altercation with a rival organization that had ended with 3 people dead and Adrian walking free due to lack of evidence. The contrast between these versions of him and the man who had listened to me talk about my dreams for hours, who had touched me with such careful attention, created a cognitive dissonance I couldn't resolve. Which one was real? Could both be true? And what did it say about me that I still thought about him with something more complicated than pure fear? As my pregnancy progressed, the paranoia intensified. I became convinced that someone was following me, that I would turn a corner and find one of his men waiting to escort me to some confrontation I wasn't prepared for. I varied my routes home, checked over my shoulder constantly, avoided places I'd mentioned during our brief conversation in case he remembered and came looking. When a black SUV with tinted windows parked outside my building for 3 days straight, I nearly had a panic attack before realizing it belonged to my neighbor's boyfriend who was visiting from New Jersey. Every unexpected knock on my door, every unfamiliar voice in the hallway, sent my heart racing and my mind spinning through terrible scenarios. The lying took a psychological toll I hadn't anticipated. I had never been someone who lied easily or often, had prided myself on basic honesty even when it was uncomfortable. But now, my entire existence was built on deception, layer upon layer of untruths that I had to track carefully to avoid contradicting myself. I lied to my landlord about why I needed to break my lease early. I lied to my employers about mysterious medical appointments that were becoming more frequent. I lied to the few remaining people in my life about why I'd become so distant and unreliable. And I lied to myself, constantly, about whether I was doing the right thing or just taking the cowardly way out. The worst moments came late at night when I was alone with my thoughts and the baby's movements and the crushing weight of uncertainty about the future. I would lie in bed in my tiny apartment, listening to sirens and shouting from the street below, and wonder what I would do when the baby arrived. How would I afford childcare? Could I manage work and an infant alone? What would I tell my child about their father when they were old enough to ask? Would I keep lying, creating an elaborate fiction about a man who didn't exist? Or would I tell some version of the truth that would leave them with more questions than answers? I had researched every possible option: adoption, foster care, government assistance programs, nonprofit organizations that helped single mothers. I had filled out applications for subsidized housing and childcare vouchers and emergency financial aid. I had even looked into whether I could legally give the baby up without naming the father, though the thought made me feel sick with guilt and shame. But none of these options felt right, felt like the answer I was looking for, and so I just kept moving forward day by day, telling myself that somehow I would figure it out when the time came. My body was changing in ways that amazed and terrified me. The baby was active now, especially at night when I was trying to sleep, with what felt like full gymnastics routines that made my entire belly shift and ripple. I had gained weight, despite my careful eating, my face rounder than it had ever been, my ankles swollen by the end of every shift. My back ached constantly. My hips felt like they might split apart when I walked, and I had developed this waddle that I tried desperately to disguise as a normal gait. The physical discomfort was relentless, but it also felt deserved somehow, like penance for the choices I'd made. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in late October, 5 months and 2 weeks into my pregnancy, on an evening that had started out no different from any other. I had finished my secretary shift at the law firm, grabbed a sad sandwich from a bodega for dinner, and headed to my cleaning job at the corporate building in Midtown, where I'd worked for almost a year. The building housed various companies, financial firms, consulting agencies, a few tech startups, and I was responsible for the 12th through 15th floors, which meant 4 hours of emptying trash, vacuuming carpets, and cleaning bathrooms that executives barely acknowledged using. That particular evening, I felt off from the moment I arrived. The baby had been active all day, pressing against my ribs in ways that made it hard to breathe deeply, and I'd developed a headache during my commute that seemed to intensify with every passing hour. I pushed through anyway because I couldn't afford to miss a shift, not when I was already behind on saving money for when I wouldn't be able to work at all. I started on the 15th floor as usual, working my way through the offices systematically, trying not to think about how my back ached or how badly I needed to sit down. Around 8:30, my phone rang with a call from my landlord. I almost didn't answer, knowing it couldn't be good news, but some masochistic impulse made me pick up. His voice was apologetic but firm. The building had been sold, the new owners were planning renovations, and everyone had to be out by the end of the month. He understood this was difficult. He really did. But his hands were tied, and while he could return my security deposit within a week, I would need to find somewhere else to live immediately. The conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes, but by the time I hung up, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. For a moment, I just stood there in the empty hallway, staring at the industrial carpet and trying to process what this meant. I had enough money saved for another month of rent, maybe 2 if I stretched it, but finding a new apartment in New York City that I could afford on my income, especially one that would rent to a visibly pregnant single woman with no verifiable references or stable family situation, felt impossible. I thought about the baby, about what would happen if I ended up homeless, about whether this was the universe's way of telling me I'd made a terrible mistake in thinking I could do this alone. The panic hit me like a physical force, making my chest tight and my vision blur at the edges. I stumbled toward the nearest bathroom, barely making it inside before my legs gave out, and I sank to the floor against the wall. And then, for the first time since I'd found out I was pregnant, I completely fell apart. The tears came in huge, gasping sobs that I couldn't control. The kind of crying that makes your whole body shake and your throat raw. I wrapped my arms around my belly, feeling the baby moving inside me, and cried for everything I'd lost and everything I was afraid of losing still. I don't know how long I sat there on that cold tile floor, hunched over my pregnant belly in an empty bathroom in a building where I was supposed to be working. It could have been 5 minutes or 30. All I knew was that at some point, I became aware of footsteps in the hallway, heavy and deliberate, stopping right outside the bathroom door. I tried to quiet my crying, to pull myself together, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The door handle turned even though I'd locked it, and then the entire door frame shuddered as someone forced it open with what sounded like a single powerful kick. I looked up, tears still streaming down my face, and saw him. Adrian Caruso stood in the doorway of that bathroom like an apparition from my worst nightmares and most secret wishes, dressed in a 3-piece navy suit that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. His dark hair perfectly styled in that slicked-back way I remembered, a diamond-studded watch catching the fluorescent light. For a moment, we just stared at each other, and I watched his expression shift from concern to shock, to something I couldn't quite identify as his eyes traveled from my tear-stained face down to where my arms were wrapped protectively around a belly that was no longer possible to hide. His voice, when he finally spoke, was rough and low and filled with an emotion I'd never heard from him before. "Natalie." Just my name. but the way he said it made me start crying harder. He moved toward me, and I instinctively pressed myself harder against the wall, which made him stop mid-step like I'd slapped him. "How long?" he asked, and I could hear him fighting to keep his voice level. "How long have you been pregnant?" I couldn't answer, couldn't form words past the sobs that kept coming. He crouched down slowly, carefully, keeping some distance between us like he was approaching a frightened animal. Up close, I could see details I'd forgotten. The small scar above his left eyebrow, the exact shade of his eyes which were darker than I remembered, the way a muscle in his jaw tightened when he was trying to control himself. "Who's the father, Natalie?" His voice had gone very quiet, very dangerous. "Tell me now, who's the father?" The question hung in the air between us, and I knew I had seconds to make a decision that would change everything. I could lie, tell him it was someone else, some invented boyfriend or random hookup that had nothing to do with him. But looking into his eyes, seeing the way he was barely holding himself together, I couldn't do it. The truth came out in a whisper that was barely audible. "You are." I watched the words hit him like a physical blow. He rocked back on his heels, his hand coming up to his mouth, his eyes going wide with something that looked like shock and fury and hurt all mixed together. "You're telling me," he said slowly, his accent thickening the way it had that night when his emotions had overcome his careful control, "that you've been carrying my child for—" He gestured at my obvious belly. "Months? And you didn't think I deserved to know?" "I was scared," I managed to say through my tears. "I didn't know what you would do. I didn't know if you would—" I couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't articulate all the terrible scenarios I'd imagined. His expression hardened, and when he spoke again, his voice was cold enough to make me shiver. "What did you think I would do, Natalie? What exactly did you imagine?" He stood up abruptly, pacing the small bathroom like a caged animal. "Did you think I would hurt you, force you to do something you didn't want, make you disappear?" Each question was sharper than the last, and I could hear genuine pain underneath the anger. "I don't know you," I said, and it came out more defensive than I intended. "We spent one night together. I only knew what I read about you online, and none of it suggested you would be happy about an accidental pregnancy with someone you barely knew." He turned to face me so fast I flinched. "One night," he repeated, his voice incredulous. "You think that was just one night to me? You think I haven't spent the last 6 months trying to find you, wondering what I did wrong to make you run away like I was some kind of monster?" He ran his hand through his hair, disrupting the perfect styling. "I had people searching for you, Natalie. Discreetly, because I didn't want to scare you, but I looked. Do you have any idea how much it costs to disappear from someone with my resources? How carefully you must have hidden?" I stared at him, processing this information that contradicted everything I'd assumed. "You looked for me?" My voice came out small, uncertain. "Of course I looked for you," he said, and suddenly all the anger seemed to drain out of him, leaving behind something that looked almost like devastation. He sank down against the opposite wall, putting his head in his hands. "That night meant something to me. You meant something to me. And then you just vanished, and I thought—" He stopped, looked up at me with eyes that held too much emotion. I thought I'd imagined the connection, that I'd misread everything, that I was just another rich man who'd convinced himself a beautiful woman actually wanted him for more than his money. The vulnerability in his admission made my chest ache. "It wasn't like that," I said quietly. "That night it was real. All of it was real. That's why I ran, because it scared me how much I felt, how fast everything happened. And then I found out who you really were, and I panicked." He was quiet for a long moment, studying my face like he was trying to read my thoughts. So instead of talking to me, Instead of giving me a chance to be part of this, you decided to hide my child from me for months. To struggle alone, to cry on bathroom floors, to... His gaze swept over my cheap, oversized clothes, my tired face, and I could see him piecing together just how difficult things had been. How have you been managing? Financially? With medical care? I've been managing, I said, lifting my chin with what little pride I had left. I have 2 jobs. I found a clinic. You've been barely surviving. He cut me off, his voice hard. Don't lie to me, Natalie. Not now. Not about this. He stood up, and suddenly he was looming over me, this tall, powerful man who could probably destroy my life with a phone call if he wanted to. You're coming with me. What? I tried to push myself up off the floor, but my body wouldn't cooperate. No, I can't just... This isn't a negotiation. He reached down, and before I could protest, he'd scooped me up in his arms like I weighed nothing, pregnancy belly and all. You're exhausted, you're upset, and you're carrying my child. We're going somewhere safe where we can talk properly, where you're not sitting on a bathroom floor in a building where you shouldn't be working in your condition in the first place. Put me down, I said, but there was no force behind it. The truth was, I was so tired, so overwhelmed, and being held by someone who actually seemed to care about my well-being, even if he was also furious with me, felt better than I wanted to admit. Adrian carried me out of that bathroom and through the empty office building like I was something precious and breakable, his arms steady and strong around me, despite my protests that I could walk. In the elevator, I caught our reflection in the mirrored walls, him in his expensive suit looking every inch the powerful man he was, me in my cleaning uniform with tear-stained cheeks and a belly I could no longer hide. The contrast between us almost absurd. His jaw was set in a hard line, and I could see a muscle ticking in his cheek that suggested he was holding back a storm of emotions through sheer force of will. 3 men in dark suits were waiting in the lobby, and they didn't even blink at the sight of their boss carrying a pregnant woman through the marble-floored entrance. One of them moved ahead to open the door of a black SUV that had pulled up to the curb. Another spoke quietly into his phone in what sounded like Italian, and the third scanned the street with the practiced alertness of someone expecting trouble. Adrian settled me into the back seat with surprising gentleness before sliding in beside me, and within seconds we were moving through the Manhattan traffic with the kind of smooth efficiency that suggested the driver had done this countless times before. I stared out the window, watching the city lights blur past, trying to process what was happening. This was the scenario I'd been afraid of for months. Being found, being confronted, being pulled into Adrian's world whether I wanted to be or not. Except it wasn't playing out the way I'd imagined. He wasn't threatening me or trying to take control through intimidation. He was just sitting there beside me, occasionally glancing at my belly with an expression I couldn't quite read, looking almost as overwhelmed as I felt. We drove to a building in Tribeca that screamed expensive even from the outside. One of those converted warehouses with floor-to-ceiling windows, and a doorman who nodded at Adrian with the kind of deference that suggested he owned the place, which he probably did. The penthouse apartment he took me to was exactly what I would have expected if I'd thought about it. Modern, spacious, decorated with art that probably cost more than most people's houses, with views of the city that would have been breathtaking if I'd been in any state to appreciate them. He guided me to a leather couch that was so soft I nearly disappeared into it, then disappeared into what I assumed was the kitchen. I heard cabinets opening, the sound of running water, and then he returned with a glass and handed it to me. "Drink," he said, not quite in order but close. "You're dehydrated from crying." I took the water because he was right and because I didn't have the energy to argue. He sat down across from me in an armchair, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, and for a long moment we just looked at each other. Up close, I could see that he looked tired too, with shadows under his eyes that suggested he'd been sleeping as poorly as I had. The expensive clothes and perfect grooming couldn't quite hide the tension in his shoulders, or the exhaustion in his expression. "Start from the beginning," he said finally. "Tell me everything." So I did. I told him about taking the pregnancy test, about the panic and fear and impossible decisions, about moving apartments and changing my number and quitting school. I told him about the clinic appointments I went to alone, about the ultrasound images I kept hidden in a box, about talking to the baby late at night when I couldn't sleep. I told him about selling my possessions to pay for prenatal vitamins, about the lies I'd told everyone I knew, about the crushing loneliness of going through pregnancy without a single person to share it with. And I told him about the phone call tonight, about losing my apartment and feeling like everything was falling apart at once. He listened without interrupting, his expression becoming progressively darker as I spoke. When I finally finished, he was quiet for a long time, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles were white. "You should have come to me," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion he was barely controlling. "The moment you found out, you should have found a way to contact me." "I was terrified of you," I said honestly. "Of who you are, what you do, what you might do to me or the baby. Every article I read made you sound dangerous and unpredictable, and I didn't know if I was just some random hookup you'd already forgotten or if—" "You were never random," he interrupted, his eyes intense on mine. "That night with you was the first time in years I'd felt like I could be something other than what everyone expects me to be. You talked to me like I was just a man, not a name or a reputation or something to be afraid of. Do you have any idea how rare that is in my world?" I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. The raw honesty in his voice was breaking down walls I'd built up over months of self-protection. He stood up abruptly, began pacing the expensive hardwood floors. "I understand why you were scared. I'm not blind to what people say about me, and most of it is true. I've done things that would horrify you, made choices that haunt me, built my life in a world where violence is currency and loyalty is bought with fear." He stopped, turned to face me. "But I would never, never hurt you or a child, especially not my child." "How was I supposed to know that?" I asked, and I could hear the desperation in my own voice. "You're essentially a stranger who happens to be the father of my baby. I didn't know what you would do, and I couldn't take the risk." His expression shifted, became something almost vulnerable. "My father," he said quietly, "was a violent man who used his fists on my mother regularly and his children occasionally. I watched her make excuses for black eyes and broken ribs, watched her fade into someone I didn't recognize. When she finally got sick, cancer that might have been treatable if she'd had the money and access to proper care, he barely visited the hospital. She died when I was 15, and I swore on her grave that I would never become him, that if I ever had a family I would protect them with everything I had." I felt tears starting again, but for different reasons this time. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I didn't know." "Of course you didn't know," he said, and some of the hardness left his voice. "We had one night, Natalie. One perfect night that I've replayed 1,000 times, trying to figure out what I did to make you run. But we're past that now. The question is what we do moving forward." He sat back down, and this time he looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "I want to be involved. Not just financially, though obviously I'm going to take care of that immediately. I want to be part of this pregnancy, part of our child's life. I want—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "I want us to try. Not because you're pregnant, though that's certainly a factor, but because I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since that night. Because when I heard you crying and recognized your voice, my first thought wasn't about the pregnancy or the deception. It was that I'd finally found you, and I wasn't going to let you disappear again. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Adrian, I don't know if I can be part of your world. The things you do, the danger. I'll change," he said immediately. "Not who I am fundamentally, but the parts that put you at risk. I've been thinking about stepping back from certain operations anyway, delegating more to people I trust. And I have resources you can't imagine. Security, protection, the ability to make sure you and the baby are safe no matter what threats might arise." "That's not normal," I said, almost laughing despite everything. "Normal people don't need security teams and protection details. We stopped being normal people the moment you got pregnant with the heir to the Caruso family," he said bluntly. "Whether you like it or not, this child makes you both targets. My enemies will see you as leverage, as a weakness they can exploit. The only way to keep you safe is to bring you into my protection fully, to make it clear that touching you means war with me." The reality of what he was saying settled over me like a weight. I'd been so focused on hiding from Adrian that I'd never really considered the other dangers that might exist, the threats from people I didn't even know existed. "This is insane," I said. My life was supposed to be simple. I was supposed to finish college, maybe start a small business, live in a normal apartment and have a normal family. "Maybe you still can," he said softly. "Just with some very well-paid security personnel in the background and a significantly nicer apartment." He reached out slowly, giving me time to pull away, and when I didn't, he placed his hand gently on my belly. The baby kicked immediately, as if responding to his touch, and I watched his expression transform into something like wonder. The next few days passed in a blur of changes that happened so fast I could barely process them. Adrian didn't ask for my permission or input so much as inform me of decisions he'd already made, and while part of me bristled at his high-handed approach, I was too exhausted and overwhelmed to fight most of it. Within 24 hours of that bathroom confrontation, he'd moved all my possessions from my tiny apartment in Washington Heights to a secure building in the Upper East Side, where he maintained what he called a safe house. A 3-bedroom apartment with round-the-clock security, a kitchen that was bigger than my entire previous living space, and windows that overlooked Central Park, with views that probably cost more per month than I'd made in a year. He didn't move in with me, which surprised me until I realized he was trying to give me space to adjust, to not overwhelm me more than he already had. But he was there constantly. Morning, afternoon, evening, showing up with takeout from restaurants I'd only read about in magazines, with prenatal vitamins from a pharmacy that apparently delivered to his home, with books about pregnancy and parenting that he'd clearly spent hours selecting. He attended every doctor's appointment, sitting in the examination room with an intensity that made Dr. Chen raise her eyebrows but ask no questions, his hand finding mine when we heard the heartbeat, his expression unreadable when he saw the ultrasound images that showed a baby who was healthy and growing right on schedule. The transformation in how I lived was jarring and uncomfortable in ways I hadn't expected. Suddenly, I had everything I desperately needed for months: proper nutrition, adequate rest, medical care that didn't require me to choose between prescriptions and rent. But accepting it all made me feel like I'd lost something fundamental about my independence. Adrian had insisted I quit both my jobs immediately, and when I'd protested that I needed to work, that I couldn't just accept his charity, he'd looked at me like I was being deliberately obtuse, and pointed out that growing his child was work enough, and that I should have been resting months ago, instead of cleaning office buildings while 5 months pregnant. He'd deposited money into a bank account he'd opened in my name, an amount that made me actually gasp when I saw the statement. When I tried to argue about it, tried to establish some boundaries around his financial support, he'd cut me off with a tone that brooked no argument. "You're carrying my heir," he'd said, and there was something in his voice that made it clear this was non-negotiable. "Every single thing you need, every comfort that makes this pregnancy easier, every expense related to the baby. It's not charity, Natalie. It's my responsibility, and frankly, my privilege. Don't insult either of us by pretending you don't need the help." But it wasn't just about money or comfort or logistics. What unsettled me most was how Adrian was around me, how he seemed to be genuinely trying to be different from what I'd expected. He was still intense, still commanding, still clearly someone who was used to getting his way and had the power to make it happen. But with me, he was careful in ways that suggested he was constantly monitoring himself, reining in impulses that might scare me or make me pull away. He asked before touching my belly, even though I could see how much he wanted to feel the baby move. He listened when I talked about my fears or concerns without trying to immediately fix everything. He brought me books and music and ridiculous amounts of food, learning my preferences through trial and error with a focus that would have been touching if it wasn't also slightly overwhelming. We talked more than I'd expected about everything and nothing. He told me about growing up in his family, about the expectations and pressures and violence that had shaped him, about his mother who he'd loved, and his father who he'd feared and eventually replaced. He was honest about his business in ways that sometimes made me uncomfortable. He didn't glorify it, or pretend it was something it wasn't, but he also didn't apologize for choices he'd made to survive and eventually thrive in a world that had very different rules than the one I knew. And slowly, carefully, he began sharing his vision for how things could be different, for how he could step back from the most dangerous aspects of his operations and focus on legitimate businesses that wouldn't put his family at risk. I've been thinking about this for a while. He admitted one evening while we were sitting in the apartment's living room, him in an armchair and me on the couch, with my feet propped up because my ankles had started swelling. Even before I found you again. The violence, the constant threat of prosecution or war with rivals, it's exhausting and it's not sustainable. I have lieutenants who are capable of running most operations, who've been loyal for years and deserve more responsibility. I can maintain oversight without being directly involved in things that might get me killed or imprisoned. Can you really walk away? I asked skeptically. I thought once you were in that life, you were in it permanently. I'm not talking about walking away entirely, he clarified. I'll always be who I am, always have connections and influence. And yes, some business interests that operate in gray areas. But there's a difference between being the person who makes every decision and gets their hands dirty, and being someone who delegates and maintains strategic control from a distance. My child deserves a father who's present, who's not constantly looking over his shoulder or preparing for the next attack. I wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that he could change enough to make this work. But I'd read enough about organized crime to know that leaving wasn't simple, that enemies didn't just forget about you because you decided to be less involved. What about the people who see the baby as leverage? I asked, voicing the fear that had been growing since he'd first mentioned it. You said your enemies would target us. How does you stepping back change that? His expression hardened. It doesn't, not entirely. Which is why you'll have security with you whenever you leave this apartment. Why the baby will have protection from the moment they're born. Why I'm restructuring my entire operation to eliminate the rivals who pose the biggest threats. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. I know this isn't the life you wanted, Natalie. I know it's not normal or simple or anything like what you imagined when you thought about having a family. But I can keep you safe. Both of you. That's not arrogance. It's a promise I'm prepared to back up with every resource I have. The certainty in his voice should have been reassuring, but instead, it just highlighted how far my life had diverged from anything I'd planned. I thought about the girl I'd been 6 months ago, the one who'd been focused on finishing college and building a modest, stable life. That version of me felt like a stranger now, someone naive who'd had no idea how quickly everything could change. I'm scared, I admitted quietly. Of this world, of what it means for our child, of whether I'm strong enough to survive in it. You're already surviving in it, he said. You've been surviving it for months, alone, with no support and minimal resources. You're stronger than you think, Natalie. You just need to stop trying to do everything by yourself and let someone help carry the weight. Over the following weeks, I started to let myself believe that maybe, possibly, this could work. Adrian was relentless in his attention, showing up every day with the kind of consistency that slowly wore down my defenses. He learned what foods made my morning sickness worse and brought alternatives. He noticed when I was tired and insisted I rest, sometimes physically guiding me to the bedroom and staying until I fell asleep. He asked questions about the baby constantly. Did I have preferences for names? How did I want to decorate the nursery? Did I want to know the sex or wait until birth? With an enthusiasm that felt genuine rather than obligatory. But there were also moments that reminded me exactly who he was and what his world entailed. Like the afternoon when I heard him on the phone speaking rapid Italian, his voice cold and commanding in ways I'd never heard directed at me, clearly issuing threats or orders that made whoever was on the other end scramble to comply. Or the night when he showed up with bruised knuckles and a cut above his eye that he dismissed as just business, refusing to elaborate despite my questions. Or the constant presence of security personnel who appeared whenever I left the apartment, silent men and women who watched everything with the kind of alertness that suggested they were expecting trouble. The pregnancy itself was progressing normally according to Dr. Chen, though my blood pressure had been running slightly high at the last few appointments, something she attributed to stress, and told me to monitor carefully. The baby was active and healthy, measuring right on track, and I'd finally agreed to find out the sex at the next ultrasound after Adrian had asked about 15 times with barely concealed excitement. He was convinced it was a boy, talked about teaching him things and protecting him and giving him the childhood that Adrian himself had never had. And the tenderness in those moments made my chest ache with complicated emotions I wasn't ready to name. We hadn't discussed the specifics of our relationship, hadn't defined what we were to each other beyond two people having a baby together. He hadn't tried to kiss me or touch me in any way that went beyond the careful, almost reverent way he put his hands on my belly to feel the baby move. I didn't know if it was because he was giving me space to adjust or if he simply didn't see me that way anymore, and I was too afraid to ask because I wasn't sure what answer I wanted to hear. Everything changed on a cold November evening when I was 6 months pregnant and starting to feel like maybe we had figured out a fragile equilibrium that could actually work. Adrian had left earlier that afternoon for what he'd described as an important meeting with some associates, promising to be back for dinner and asking what I wanted him to bring. I'd been reading in the living room, occasionally talking to the baby about everything and nothing, when I heard shouting from the hallway outside the apartment, followed by sounds that could only be gunfire. My entire body went cold with terror. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and tried to call Adrian, but it went straight to voicemail. The security guard who was supposed to be stationed outside my door burst in, a woman named Maria who'd been nothing but professional in the weeks I'd known her. "We need to move you now," she said, her voice urgent but controlled. "There's been a breach in the building. Protocol is to get you to the safe room immediately." I barely remember the next few minutes. Maria half carrying me through the apartment to what I'd thought was a closet, but turned out to be a reinforced panic room with its own ventilation system and communication equipment. Her barking orders into her radio while sealing the heavy door behind us. I sat on the floor because there was nowhere else to sit, my arms wrapped around my belly protectively, listening to muffled sounds from outside that might have been more gunfire, or might have been my imagination. The baby was moving frantically, responding to my elevated heart rate and stress hormones, and I tried to breathe slowly and stay calm like they taught in all those prenatal classes I'd attended online. But terror was making that almost impossible. It felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes before the door opened again, and Adrian appeared, looking absolutely wild with fear and rage. He had blood on his shirt, whether his or someone else's I couldn't tell, and his hair was disheveled in a way I'd never seen, the usually perfect styling completely destroyed. He was across the room in 2 strides, pulling me up from the floor and into his arms so tightly I could barely breathe, his hands shaking as they moved over me like he was checking for injuries. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, almost unrecognizable. "Did anyone touch you? Is the baby..." "We're fine," I managed to say, though I was shaking so hard I could barely get the words out. "What happened? What was that?" His expression turned absolutely murderous. "Rivals," he said shortly. "The Moretti family, trying to send a message by going after you. They didn't get close. Maria and the team did their job, but they tried, and that's enough." He was still holding me, and I could feel the tension vibrating through his entire body. "I'm ending this, tonight. They wanted a war, and they're going to get one, but not the kind they expected." "Adrian, no," I started to say, but he cut me off with a look that was pure predator, nothing gentle or careful about it. "This is not up for discussion," he said, and there was steel in his voice. "They went after my child, my family. There are lines you don't cross in our world, and they crossed the most fundamental one. I gave them chances to back down, to acknowledge boundaries, and they refused. So now I respond the only way people like them understand." I could see there was no arguing with him, not in this state, and honestly I wasn't sure I wanted to argue. They'd tried to get to me, to the baby, and some primal part of me that I didn't entirely recognize wanted them to pay for that. "What are you going to do?" I asked quietly. "What I should have done months ago," he said. "Eliminate the threat completely. Remove the people who run the Moretti operations. Dismantle their infrastructure. Make it clear to every other family in the region that you are absolutely untouchable." He pulled back slightly, cupping my face in his hands. "I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" I nodded, even though I wasn't entirely sure what I was agreeing to. He kissed my forehead gently, such a contrast to the violence I could feel coiling in him. And then he was giving Maria detailed instructions about security protocols and backup plans and things I only half understood. He told me he'd be back as soon as possible, that I should stay in the apartment with enhanced security, that everything would be different after tonight. And then he was gone, and I was left alone with my fear and my racing thoughts and a baby who wouldn't stop kicking. Maria tried to get me to eat something, to rest, but I couldn't do either. I paced the apartment for hours, imagining worst-case scenarios, wondering what eliminate the threat actually meant in practice, terrified that Adrian wouldn't come back or that he would come back changed in ways I couldn't handle. The baby's movements became more agitated as the night wore on, responding to my stress in ways that made me feel guilty and helpless. It was almost dawn when Adrian finally returned, looking exhausted and grim but uninjured. He found me in the nursery we'd been slowly putting together, sitting in the rocking chair and staring at the empty crib. He didn't say anything at first, just pulled me up and held me, and I could feel how tightly wound he still was despite the weariness in his body. "Is it over?" I asked against his chest. "It's over," he confirmed. "The Moretti leadership is gone, their operations dismantled, their territory redistributed. The other families have been informed that you and the baby are under my absolute protection, and anyone who threatens that will face the same consequences. You're safe now, Natalie. I promise you're safe." I wanted to ask for details, wanted to know exactly what he'd done and who had died, and whether I should be horrified or grateful, or both. But looking at his face, seeing the weight of whatever had happened in the shadows of the last few hours, I couldn't make myself ask. Instead, I just nodded and let him lead me to bed, where he held me while I finally fell asleep from pure exhaustion. The next few weeks were strange and tense. Adrian was different after that night, harder in some ways, but also more determined to prove that he could be the father and partner he'd promised to be. He accelerated his plans to step back from direct operations, promoted people he trusted to handle the day-to-day business, and spent more time with me than I'd ever expected. He was there for every appointment, every milestone, every moment of discomfort or fear. He read pregnancy books with an intensity that would have been amusing if it wasn't also touching, asked Dr. Chen so many questions that she started bringing extra time to our appointments, and generally threw himself into preparing for fatherhood with the same focus he'd probably once applied to building his empire. We still hadn't defined what we were to each other, but something had shifted after the attack. We were closer now, united by the very real danger we'd faced, and the baby that connected us more surely than any words could. He still didn't push for physical intimacy beyond holding me when I needed comfort, or putting his hands on my belly to feel the baby move. But there was a tenderness in how he looked at me that made my heart race in ways that had nothing to do with fear. I went into labor 3 weeks early, on a snowy January afternoon, when Adrian was in a meeting with his lawyers about transferring various business assets. My water broke dramatically while I was trying to organize the nursery, and suddenly everything became chaos. Maria calling for backup, Adrian appearing within minutes looking absolutely terrified despite his attempts to stay calm, the drive to the hospital that felt both too fast and not fast enough. And then hours of labor that were simultaneously the most painful and most profound experience of my life, with Adrian holding my hand through every contraction, whispering encouragement in English and Italian, looking at me like I was performing some kind of miracle. The attack came during the final stage of labor, when I was too far gone to really process what was happening. I heard shouting, saw Adrian pull a gun from somewhere, watched him position himself between me and the door, with an expression that promised death to anyone who came through it. Maria and the rest of the security team locked down the delivery room, while hospital security dealt with what turned out to be a last desperate attempt by remaining Moretti associates to harm us. It was over in minutes. The threat neutralized before it could get anywhere near us, but it cemented something fundamental. Our child was being born into violence whether I liked it or not, and the only way to protect them was to accept Adrian's world fully. And then, after hours of pain and fear and effort, our son was born. Adrian cut the umbilical cord with hands that shook slightly, and when the doctor placed our baby in his arms, I watched this dangerous, powerful man who'd killed people just weeks ago break down completely. He cried holding our son, whispered promises in Italian that I couldn't understand but felt in my bones, and looked at me with such raw emotion that I started crying too. "I'm going to protect you," he said, and I knew he meant both of us. Both of you. Whatever it takes, however I need to change, I'll do it. You're my family now, Natalie. The only thing that matters. I reached up to touch his face, this man who terrified me and comforted me in equal measure, and said the words that had been building for weeks. I love you. I don't know when it happened, or if it's smart, or if I'm making a terrible mistake. But I love you. His expression transformed into something that looked like wonder and relief and determination all mixed together. I fell in love with you that first night, he admitted, and I've been falling harder ever since. I know my world is violent and dangerous and not what you wanted, but I swear I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret giving me this chance. He kissed me then, finally, with our son between us and the sound of security teams outside the door and the knowledge that nothing about our life would be normal or easy. But looking at our baby, at this tiny perfect person we'd created, I realized that maybe normal was overrated anyway. Maybe what we had was better, harder and scarier, and requiring more courage than I'd known I possessed, but real in ways that transcended any fairy tale I'd once imagined. In the days that followed, Adrian made good on his promises. He stepped back from his most dangerous operations, restructured his entire organization to prioritize our family's safety, and began the long process of transitioning toward legitimate businesses that wouldn't put our son at risk. It wasn't a complete transformation. He was still who he was, still had connections and power that operated in shadows. But it was genuine change, the kind that came from loving something more than he loved power. We moved to a house outside the city with security that rivaled a fortress, created a life that balanced Adrian's business needs with our son's safety and my slowly rebuilding sense of self. I started taking online classes again, working toward finishing my degree on my own timeline, with Adrian's full support and encouragement. We built something that looked almost like a normal family, if you ignored the armed security, and the occasional meetings with people who clearly operated outside the law. Our son, who we named Marco after Adrian's mother's maiden name, grew up knowing he was loved fiercely by both parents, protected absolutely, an heir to a complicated legacy that we would help him navigate when he was old enough to understand. And I learned that love doesn't always look like you expect it to, that sometimes the person you're most afraid of becomes the person you can't imagine living without, and that family, real family, is worth every risk, every fear, and every moment of courage it takes to choose it over safety. I'd hidden the truth for months, terrified of what Adrian would do when he found out. But in the end, that truth became the foundation for something stronger than I'd ever imagined. A love built not on perfection or ease, but on choosing each other every single day despite the dangers, the differences, and the impossible complications of the world we inhabited together. The first few months of Marco's life were a study in contradictions that I never could have anticipated. Moments of pure domestic bliss interwoven with stark reminders that our family existed in a world most people only saw in movies. I would be sitting in our nursery at 3 a.m, feeding our son while watching the sunrise over the heavily secured property, feeling like the most normal new mother in the world. And then I'd notice the armed guard doing rounds outside the window, and remember that normal had never really been an option for us. Adrian had meant what he said about protection, about restructuring his entire life around keeping us safe, and the evidence of that commitment was everywhere I looked. The house he'd chosen for us was technically in Westchester, far enough from the city to feel almost suburban, but close enough that he could still attend necessary meetings when required. It was beautiful in an understated way. Not the ostentatious mansion I might have expected, but a renovated colonial with good bones, tall windows that let in natural light, and enough property that the security measures could be implemented without making it feel like we lived in a compound. He'd consulted me on every decision about the interior, learning my preferences and tastes with the same intensity he applied to everything else, and the result was a home that actually felt like mine, rather than just another space he controlled. But the security was undeniable, and sometimes suffocating. There were cameras covering every angle of the property, motion sensors in the woods that surrounded us, a panic room even more sophisticated than the one in the apartment, and a rotating team of guards who operated in shifts around the clock. Maria had become our head of security, and while I'd grown to trust her completely, there were moments when I resented needing her at all. When I wanted to take my baby for a walk without coordinating with armed professionals about routes and timing and potential threats. Adrian was navigating his own complicated transition, and I could see the strain it put on him even as he tried to hide it from me. He'd been true to his word about stepping back from direct involvement in the most violent aspects of his business, delegating authority to lieutenants he'd been grooming for years, focusing his attention on legitimate enterprises that couldn't be traced back to organized crime. But pulling away from that world wasn't as simple as just making a decision. There were expectations he had to manage, alliances he had to maintain carefully so they didn't feel betrayed or weakened, and a constant need to prove that his reduced involvement didn't mean he was weak or vulnerable to challenge. I watched him take phone calls at odd hours, his voice dropping into that cold, commanding tone that still made me shiver sometimes, issuing orders or making decisions about things he carefully never discussed with me in detail. He would disappear for meetings that lasted hours, coming home with tension written across his shoulders and exhaustion in his eyes, and I learned not to ask too many questions about where he'd been or what he'd done. It wasn't that he was deliberately hiding things from me. We'd established early on that I didn't want or need to know the specifics of operations that might keep me awake at night, but rather that we'd found an unspoken agreement about the boundaries between his business and our family life. What surprised me most was how naturally he took to fatherhood, how the same intensity and focus that made him dangerous in his professional world translated into complete devotion to our son. He was involved in every aspect of Marco's care, in ways that defied every stereotype I'd ever heard about powerful men and parenting. He learned to change diapers with the same precision he probably applied to planning operations, studied baby development milestones like they were intelligence reports, and got up for night feedings without complaint, even when I knew he had important meetings the next morning. I would find him in the nursery at random hours just watching Marco sleep, his expression soft in ways I'd never seen when he thought no one was looking. The vulnerability he showed around our son was almost harder to witness than his professional ruthlessness had been. He was terrified of doing something wrong, of somehow damaging this perfect little person we'd created. And that fear made him second-guess himself in ways that were completely foreign to a man who normally made decisions with absolute certainty. He asked me constantly if he was holding Marco correctly, if he was feeding him right, if the baby seemed happy or uncomfortable, or in need of something Adrian didn't know how to provide. And when Marco would curl his tiny hand around Adrian's finger or fall asleep on his father's chest, I would watch this feared mobster absolutely melt with an emotion so pure it made my heart ache. We were learning to be partners, not just co-parents, but actual partners in building a life together, and it was harder than I'd expected. We came from such different worlds, had such different experiences and expectations, that even simple decisions could become complicated negotiations. I wanted Marco to have a normal childhood with playdates and public parks and regular school, while Adrian's instinct was to keep him isolated and protected with private tutors and carefully vetted companions. I believed in letting him develop independence gradually, while Adrian struggled with the idea of our son being anywhere we couldn't see him, or beyond the reach of immediate security. We fought about these things, sometimes late into the night after Marco was asleep. Both of us passionate about what we thought was best for our child, but we also learned to compromise, to find middle ground between my hopes for normalcy and his need for security. Adrian agreed to let Marco have experiences outside our protected bubble as long as appropriate precautions were in place, while I acknowledged that some level of security was necessary and not just Adrian being paranoid. We talked about our own childhoods, about what we'd missed and what we wanted to give our son, and those conversations helped us understand each other in deeper ways. I began to see how Adrian's need for control came from a place of profound fear. Fear of losing us the way he'd lost his mother. Fear of failing to protect what mattered most. Fear that one mistake could cost him everything he'd finally allowed himself to care about. My relationship with Adrian himself continued to evolve in ways that both thrilled and terrified me. We'd acknowledged our feelings for each other in that hospital room, but actually building a romantic relationship while simultaneously learning to parent together was complicated. We were living in the same house, raising a child together, but we hadn't discussed marriage or made any formal commitment beyond our shared dedication to Marco. Adrian had given me the master bedroom while he took a guest room down the hall, respecting my need for space, even though I could sometimes feel his frustration with the arrangement. The physical tension between us was constant and growing. He would brush past me in the hallway and I'd feel electricity shoot through my entire body. I'd watch him hold our son and want nothing more than to be wrapped in those same arms. He'd look at me sometimes with such naked desire that I'd have to look away before I did something impulsive. But we were both holding back, both afraid of rushing into something before we'd fully established the foundation of trust and partnership we needed. It was about 4 months after Marco's birth when things finally shifted. I'd been cleared by my doctor to resume normal activities, though the exhaustion of new motherhood and the lingering effects of pregnancy made normal feel like a distant goal. Adrian had been away for a 2-day trip to the city to handle some business he couldn't avoid, and when he returned late on a Saturday night, I was still awake in the living room, unable to sleep despite my exhaustion. He found me curled up on the couch with a book I wasn't really reading, and something about the way he looked at me made my breath catch. "I missed you," he said simply, and there was such raw honesty in those 3 words that I felt something crack open in my chest. Not just Marco, though of course I missed him too, but you, Natalie. I miss talking to you, hearing your laugh, just being in the same room with you. These last 2 days felt like torture. I set down my book, my heart pounding. "I missed you too," I admitted. "The house feels empty when you're not here. Marco kept looking around like he was searching for you, and I kept wanting to tell you things, or ask your opinion, or just... I stopped, not sure how to articulate the depth of what I was feeling. He crossed the room slowly, giving me time to object or pull away, and when I didn't, he sat beside me on the couch, close enough that I could feel the heat of his body. "I've been trying to give you space," he said quietly, "trying not to push you into anything before you were ready. But I need you to know that what I feel for you isn't just about Marco or obligation or gratitude. I'm in love with you, Natalie. Completely. The way you are with our son, your strength, your stubbornness when you think I'm being too controlling, the way you've adapted to this insane life without losing who you are. Everything about you makes me fall harder." I reached up to touch his face, tracing the sharp line of his jaw, the small scar above his eyebrow. "I'm scared," I whispered. "Scared of how much I feel. Scared of your world. Scared that something will happen and I'll lose this before I've really had a chance to appreciate it." "I'm scared too," he admitted, and the vulnerability in his eyes was almost painful to see. "Terrified that I'll fail you, that I won't be able to keep you safe, that you'll wake up one day and realize you've made a terrible mistake tying yourself to someone like me. But I'm more scared of not trying, of living in the same house with you, and pretending that what we have is just co-parenting when it's so much more than that." I kissed him then, finally closing the distance we'd been maintaining for months, and it felt like coming home and jumping off a cliff simultaneously. He responded with a carefully controlled passion that suggested he'd been holding himself back for far longer than I'd realized, his hands moving to cup my face, his kiss deepening until I was breathless and dizzy and completely lost in the feeling of finally letting myself have this. We didn't sleep together that night. We were both too aware of Marco sleeping upstairs, too conscious of taking things slowly, despite the intensity of what we felt. But we stayed on that couch until dawn, talking and kissing and making promises about the future we wanted to build together. He asked me properly if I would marry him, not because of the baby, or because it made sense logically, but because he loved me and wanted to spend his life with me. And I said yes, knowing it meant fully accepting his world with all its complications and dangers, because the alternative, a life without him, was unthinkable. The engagement was kept private initially, just between us and our closest circle. Adrian gave me a ring that was beautiful, but not ostentatious, a single perfect diamond that caught the light in ways that made me think of that first night when everything had started. We planned a small wedding for the summer, just family and trusted friends, in the garden of our home where security could be managed, and we could celebrate without worrying about public attention or potential threats. But planning a wedding while parenting an infant and managing the complexities of Adrian's business transition was predictably chaotic. There were moments when I wondered if we should just elope, skip all the stress and complication, and just get married at City Hall with Maria and one of Adrian's most trusted associates as witnesses. But Adrian wanted to give me something special, wanted our son to be there when we made our commitment official, and his determination to make it perfect was both touching and occasionally overwhelming. The threats never completely disappeared, though they evolved as Adrian's enemies realized that direct attacks would be met with overwhelming retaliation. Instead of violence, they tried other approaches. Attempts to get information about our security procedures, efforts to find vulnerabilities in Adrian's new business structure, subtle campaigns to damage his reputation with families he was trying to maintain alliances with. Adrian handled each threat with the same cold efficiency he'd always shown. But I could see the toll it took on him. The way he worried constantly about whether he was doing enough to protect us. There were still nights when I woke up in a panic, convinced I'd heard something suspicious, only to find Adrian already awake and alert, his weapon within reach even though we had security throughout the property. There were still moments when I resented the restrictions on our lives, when I wanted to just take Marco to a playground without coordinating with armed guards or planning escape routes. And there were still times when I looked at my life and couldn't quite believe this was real, that I'd gone from hiding a pregnancy in fear to building a family with one of the most dangerous men on the East Coast. But there were also moments of pure joy that made all the complications worthwhile. Watching Adrian teach Marco to make silly faces, the two of them giggling together with identical expressions of delight. Finding love notes hidden around the house that Adrian left for me to discover, small reminders that he was thinking about me even during his busiest days. The quiet evenings when we would sit together after putting Marco to bed, just talking about everything and nothing, building the foundation of intimacy that went beyond physical attraction or shared responsibility. I finished my degree that spring, taking online courses during Marco's naps, and studying late into the night with Adrian's encouragement and support. Walking across the stage to receive my diploma, at a heavily secured ceremony that probably gave the university security nightmares, with Adrian and Marco in the audience, was one of the proudest moments of my life. It represented something fundamental about not losing myself completely in the chaos of the last year, about maintaining goals and dreams that were mine independent of being Marco's mother or Adrian's partner. Adrian made good on his promise to transition toward legitimate business, though I learned that legitimate in his world often meant technically legal, but still operating in moral gray areas. He invested heavily in real estate development, in technology startups that needed capital and connections, in hospitality ventures that benefited from his understanding of how to manage complex operations. He maintained relationships with his old world, but at a careful distance, consulting rather than commanding, advising rather than controlling. It wasn't a complete severing. That probably wasn't possible given his history. But it was genuine change that came from putting us first. We got married on a perfect June afternoon in our garden, with Marco, now 8 months old and impossibly beautiful, serving as our ring bearer with Maria's help. It was small and intimate, with fewer than 30 people in attendance, but it felt more real than any elaborate ceremony could have been. I wore a simple white dress that made Adrian's eyes go dark with desire when he saw me, and he wore a perfectly tailored suit that reminded me of that first night while being completely different. We wrote our own vows, and when Adrian promised to protect and cherish and choose me every single day, regardless of what threats or challenges arose, his voice broke with emotion that made half the guests cry. That night, after all the guests had left and Marco was asleep and the house was finally quiet, we were finally, completely together as husband and wife. It was different from that first night. Slower, more intentional, weighted with all the history and love and commitment we'd built. Adrian was reverent and passionate and completely present, and afterward, lying in his arms in the master bedroom that was now ours rather than just mine, I felt a peace I'd never experienced before. This was my family, my home, my life. Complicated and dangerous, and absolutely nothing like what I'd once imagined, but mine in ways that mattered more than any fantasy. The truth was that I'd spent months hiding from Adrian, terrified of what he might do if he discovered the pregnancy. But in the end, being found had been the best thing that could have happened. Not because his money or protection made life easier, though they certainly did, but because being with him, building this family together, had taught me that love doesn't always arrive in safe, predictable packages. Sometimes it comes wrapped in danger and complications and choices that terrify you, and you have to be brave enough to reach for it anyway. Sometimes the person you're most afraid of becomes the person you trust most completely. And sometimes hiding from the truth delays, but doesn't prevent the inevitability of love finding you exactly when you need it most, even if you're too scared to see it at the time.